Well, thank you everyone for joining us today to come talk about Celigo, to see where it potentially could fit into the Shopify ecosystem. Yeah, just to get a read for the room, can we get one of these for folks who are excited about Black Friday, Cyber Monday? No takers? Okay. Okay, sounds great. Yeah. Looks like a few people. What about for maybe a heart for someone who's heard about Celigo but has not used it before? Awesome. How about a thumbs down if you use Celigo on a day-to-day basis? Awesome. Okay, so cool. And maybe, yeah, so really this presentation is more geared towards folks who are new to Celigo, or potentially you have a upcoming project to discuss ERP integrations. So that could potentially be on the agenda, it looks like. So in this presentation, we'll look at a Hello World example, see how some of the core concepts of Celigo. So if this is like, if you're using Celigo on a day-to-day basis, this presentation isn't really for you. But yeah, so I won't take any offense if you wanted to drop off and work on more important things like preparing for Black Friday, Cyber Monday. But yeah, I also want to preface this presentation saying it's not advocating for or against Celigo. It's quite a powerful tool, but it may or may not fit into everyone's use cases. So ultimately, at the end of this presentation, the goal is for you to have the core concepts of what Celigo is, and maybe also give you an overview of potentially if it could be a solution you want to use with your clients. So before diving in, I think it's important to understand what the business problem is. So a lot of our customers are merchants that may have multiple applications across their tech stack. They may have like a ERP, whether it be NetSuite or SAP, CRM, maybe multiple marketplaces. Like for us, it would be Shopify, but it could also be Amazon and Walmart, so on and so forth. So for a lot of these operations to run smoothly, the data has to be synced across these systems. For like, for example, the order to cash process, it might touch like for Shopify where the sale is made. It might have to hit NetSuite where he is. And so making sure that data is synced across all these applications could potentially be complex and time consuming, to say the least. So I mean, wouldn't it be nice if the business could just subscribe to a service that connects all these applications together to sync the data across different applications, so the business can continue to do what's like important to them and not worry about data integration. So that's sort of where Celigo fits in. I mean, for taking this from Celigo directly, they said that Celigo's and their flagship product, the integrator.io app, moves data from one place to another. But I think honestly, like there's a lot of apps that move data from one place to other. We do that too in our work. So what makes Celigo a little bit different from other applications? So just to summarize, I mean, if you're wondering if your project is using Celigo, you can see in your Shopify app if you have like that integrator.io app installed. So that's a integration platform as a service. Essentially, it's just a service you can subscribe to where all the integrations can be centralized in one place. There's a UI where you can use to set up integration. So it's sort of geared towards like not having to code or just minimal code. And then this could be useful for non-technical folks as well, like a data analyst or a business analyst, but also for developers. So if you're familiar with Shopify Flow, this will look quite similar as well. But I think also the big important thing that might differentiate Celigo is they have this marketplace where you can use pre-built integrations. So Celigo is quite strong in their NetSuite offering. So chances are, if the customer uses NetSuite and Shopify, there's a good possibility that Celigo could be a good fit there. Yeah, so this diagram sort of shows like potentially, Celigo can connect data from different providers. They call them endpoints. It can be pushed, pulled, or in both directions. Yeah, so that's the broad overview of like why Celigo does what it does. But I think to learn more about how to use Celigo, I think it's important to understand like the core concepts and how they frame solving some of these problems, because I think knowing these foundational steps is quite useful when actually diving deep into an integration that might have like a lot of different moving parts. So I'm just going to go through just the pieces that make up a flow. So a flow is essentially a way to get data from one point to another. Starting at the very end is like the source endpoint and the destination endpoint. And notice how, yeah, that's definitely, could be an application, could be a database, it could be coming from multiple places. But in order for Celigo to speak to those endpoints, a connection has to be made. And the thing that to think about it, if you're working on Celigo, is like the price is also driven by the number of endpoints and connections that are made. So the more this could potentially be one thing to keep in mind and try to manage while you implement this. But in addition to that, once you have a connection to a particular endpoint, there are certain rules that you set to export and import that. So for example, for Shopify, we can make GraphQL queries for it or listen to webhooks. And pretty much on the flip side, then you have the import where you can import that data to a different source. So just as a real world use case example, you might have Shopify where potentially an order is created and we wanted to push that order into like an email marketing tool like Klaviyo, because perhaps in that email marketing team, they want to be quite granular in understanding what orders were made so they could maybe give adjacent marketing offerings to upsell certain products. And so that's a use case, but like very basic, that's like a flow. But perhaps within the use case, you need to do something a little bit more specific. Like the most basic one is like you need to be able to map a data from one source to another. And Celigo and the Integrator IO app has a tool to make that a little bit easier. So, I mean, if we were to have a custom implementation of this, then we'll have to map this for a lot of different, like all the different data sources, so that could get unwieldy quick. So having this mapping tool is quite useful, graphic user interface tool, and kind of gives you errors along the way if something while you test that integration. So that's quite a helpful tool to have. The other thing is perhaps for that specific use case, the customer might only be doing email marketing in a specific geographic area. So we might want to just filter that out so we don't bombard all the endpoint with certain events. So that's also a helpful tool to have. Additionally, there's also some branching. Perhaps in that same use case, the customer is using a subcontractor to do email marketing in a different region, and maybe they're using MailChimp. So maybe all of that specific market orders are routed to that new MailChimp vendor instead of the example before, which was Klaviyo. And there may be instances, let's say, for example, where we needed to augment that data that needs to be pushed with the data from a different source. So Celigo has a lookup concept where perhaps we want to look up the CRM to get additional customer preferences, and then augment that data. So these are some of the basic. I think it would be like using not using code for it, but let's say, for example, there's a more specific use case where a certain calculation needs to be made or more complex logic. Celigo does offer the ability to have hooks between these export and imports. So we can run JavaScript there, or if needed, we can also call an AWS Lambda. So quite powerful. I think with all these tools that Celigo offers, like the way to manage integrations makes it quite easy. I wouldn't say easy, but they give you all the tools that's needed to centralize all these integrations in one place. Whereas if we were to have a custom implementation of this, we would have to build all the different parts for different vendors, and it could be quite a lot of work. So I think that's what they're trying to position their product as. And I think for customers that might have multiple vendors, it could be like Celigo would be a viable option. But if the customer isn't touching that many applications, maybe Celigo would be a little bit of an overkill. But we'll talk a little bit about that in a separate slide. So I think now I'm just going to give you like a hello world example, kind of building upon what we did there. Though I want to also mention, like, I don't have all of the connections to certain vendors, like for example, NetSuite or the more interesting ones. So this would be more of a basic example, so you can kind of take a look at this legal user interface and see how those concepts could potentially map to some real world examples. Before I do the demo, do we have any questions or any feedback? If not, I will just go ahead and jump into the demo. So right now I'm using a Shopify dev store. I'm also using Klaviyo as the endpoint. And here is a look at Celigo. So within Celigo, we can see, I'm just going to go through the UI real quick, where all of the different integrations can be will be displayed here. And within an integration, you can see potentially multiple flows. I think one thing that's also quite interesting that I mentioned earlier is the marketplace. And yeah, like I mentioned, Shopify, if you're using Shopify, you're using NetSuite. This is a quite popular one, and Celigo has a strong NetSuite offering. So I think their offices are even quite close to each other. So then, I think their strongest product was probably NetSuite, and they're just branching out to other things as well. But maybe anyone want to shout out like a vendor to see if it's offered in the marketplace? No takers. We trust. Yeah, so let's say, for example, even if a specific vendor isn't available, there are some universal connectors like HTTP, GraphQL, webhooks that can be implemented to support a vendor that's not on the marketplace. But I think one of the compelling reasons for Celigo would also be like if the integration is already offered there. But yeah, okay. Apart from that, yeah, TikTok. Let's see if there's a TikTok. Okay, so there's a TikTok NetSuite. Yeah, so if you have a TikTok shop, could potentially be one. Yeah, awesome. So, like I said, if it's not on the marketplace, there is probably a way to do it as well. But apart from that, all of the things that we talked about, like the connections, the imports, the exports, the scripts, these can be managed and reused similarly, like code as well. Though I would say the visibility from actually working on it is not like looking at code, because you kind of have to dig through multiple layers to check it. Is this the same thing that's being used and whatnot? So that's something that to keep in mind as well. Apart from that, there's also like certain tools that could be helpful to use along the way to build those flows. So it's a little playground that you can go through. But yeah, so let's take a look at one of the a way to build a flow. I've already created the connections to Shopify and Klaviyo, but that's more of like just configuring things. I mean, most of this is also a lot of configuring, but yeah, there's some debugging, and as things get more complex, there's maybe a bit more hands-on work that has to be done. But let's just start with Shopify, and we want to listen to a webhook. So, okay. So in order to get a webhook, I will have to go to Shopify to configure this. Notifications, webhooks. I've already created one. I'm going to delete this one, but I'm just going to recreate it. But this is the webhooks will be signed with this. So sorry, we're going to, whoops. Yep, we're going to use this here, and then we're going to generate a public URL. We're looking for, let's try order creation. And notice here, you can also see like sample data or like a mock output of what the data is. And this can be quite helpful when you're building it out, so you can test like different pieces of the flow as opposed to like trying to build everything and test it. So I'm gonna copy and paste some of these fields in real quick just to help with this process. Or let's see, let's try this, populate with sample data. Okay, yeah, that's not going to be helpful. 1 second. Just taking this from the Shopify documentation for webhook payload. So let's save and close this for now. And here we'll add a destination for Klaviyo. Notice here, there's certain pre-built steps that for certain vendors are already created. So I'm just gonna go ahead and use this. Create order event in Klaviyo. Yeah. So this connection I already created. Yeah, so this is like, sometimes a lot of this just requires like looking at the documentation and whatnot, but let's just try to put, so yeah, like I said, the input, would have been that mock input that was coming from what I sent in earlier, and we can preview this. Okay, relationship. Okay, so there's probably something that we'll need to map, but let's save and close this for now. So like what I said earlier, there is we'll need to map the data from one source to the destination. So let's just take a look at what it currently looks like right now. Yeah, so I think for this is just something for Klaviyo. I think an attribute that needs to be added would be like a identifier for that profile, whether it be like an email or Yeah, so this looks like it's probably mapped incorrectly. So let's try that. Looking for email. Let's try this again. Okay, so now we have the email attribute there. So yeah, what I mentioned earlier, this would be like the UI tool that allows you to map the input to the output based on the shape of the data that needs to be. So this is quite, I guess, makes it quite easy. And we can, as an example, eventually we can try to add more fields, but let's just see how this goes first. Okay, so I'm gonna just try to send a sample data to see. Okay, so it looks like we have a success. I just want to make sure that's the case. Okay, something was added 11 seconds ago, so that looks like this part is working. Just gonna try to run a test real quick. So this is running a test for the whole flow. So this appears to be working. Okay. So let's try to turn this on. Okay, so when an order is created, we should be listening to a webhook that will eventually create an order event in Klaviyo. So I'm just going to try to do that real quick. Yeah, so this is just a test store. So if this was enabled and run, there should be a run history. So we'll see. It may take some time, but second. Okay, so there was a new flow success. Okay. Yeah, so we can see that now there is an event for this that is on Klaviyo. So this is yeah, just to show how that flow works. And the other thing that could be also useful is, I think with a lot of these UI tools, sometimes there's not that much visibility with like what has changed or who changed what. So I think one thing that's quite useful with Celigo is there's like an audit log, so you can also keep track of things that were changed along the way. And then you can also download, I think they have like all of these flows in a JSON that you could potentially, if it becomes useful for you. The other thing I want to also mention is there's an ability to create a snapshot of that particular integration in the worst case where you may have to roll back because something terrible happened. But let's just create the snapshot. I think one thing that though I'm not entirely sure though is like how to roll back to just one flow. I think when the revision, my understanding is it's made on the entire integration. And I think that's something that I haven't really looked into further, but I think it'd be nice if it can be done on a flow-to-flow basis, but still with the flow-to-flow basis, you still have that audit log. And let's say if there was an error that occurred, let me see if I can try to, let's just try to show how errors being displayed or how it might help you with debugging. So I'm just gonna not send this over because this is required, but let's just go ahead and try that. And just run a test for it real quick. So I think it should throw an error somewhere. No, it didn't. Let's see. Maybe 1 second. Let me just preview this. Let me just, yeah, maybe that isn't required. Let me just try to like totally cause a, delete a bunch of these fields so there's an error. I think the purpose is just to see how it could potentially help with debugging. Let me just try sending this. Okay, so yeah, here's an example of an error. Sometimes the error is helpful, sometimes it's a bit cryptic, but yeah, it's saying here that for this particular ID, there's certain invalid input metric is required. Data attribute metrics required. So it looks like we're missing a bunch of fields. I'm just going to try to run the whole flow again to also see potentially in situations where maybe there's a critical integration that we need to be aware of. There could be some alerts that are also set up as well. So let's just try. We're not going to create the alerts, but at least we can see it as an example of how these alerts might be able to be bubbled up to the team. Just gonna try this. Oops. Any questions so far?
No, it seems so clear for now.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. So if this is correct, the run history, there should be an error. Okay, let's take a look at this again. Okay, so flow was run, but apparently there was only one success on the order creation. So apparently the webhook was fine, but there was an issue here to create the event on Klaviyo. So again, it's probably going to be the same error message. So this is the data that's coming through. So like again, we can take this input data and try to like going back to the flow and then see, sorry, the mapper, what was going wrong. So yeah, it looks like, yeah, it's missing attributes. So apparently we'll just have to build that out. And I think that kind of makes sense. I was just trying to show you that, okay, with these errors, what we can do with them. And let me show you, I think there's just, yeah, notifications. So if you want to be notified of a specific flow that errored out, yeah, so that could be potentially helpful for really high critical flows. I'm just going to jump back to the presentation. But so the question is like, is Celigo right for you? I think there's a few factors to keep in mind to determine whether Celigo could potentially be good for the project or for the client. But like if you were to try to install Celigo app, you'll see like it's $9,000 a year. And like I mentioned earlier, cost is like a function of the endpoint and flows. So if you have multiple endpoints talking to multiple places, it could be like 3 times, 4 times the cost of this. Just I'm based on like some of the, just not, I guess not going into too much of the details of like the cost, but I think what I'm trying to say is like it could be quite pricey. So the one of the questions to ask is like, is there a budget for this? Potentially, like I said, if it's a smaller client, they're only using Shopify, not talking to that many applications, maybe Celigo will be overkill for now. But of course, there are also other vendors that are even more like enterprise level that potentially scale better, have more product offerings. But we can also look at that a little in the next slide. But something to also keep in mind is like I mentioned earlier, you were asking, is TikTok supported? Yeah, it looks like TikTok is supported, but perhaps we're talking with other more nuanced vendors that they might not have a built-in connector for. And then we're just going to have to use universal connectors. Maybe it doesn't make sense if we're going to always use universal connectors. I think Celigo definitely shines where there are pre-built connections. Though one thing I do want to preface about the pre-built connections, like for Shopify and NetSuite, is it's sort of like an app that we install, and we don't have that much transparency in what's going on and things that we can customize. So it's just a trade-off there. They'll maintain it up to a certain point. Like for example, if there's a version update, they'll push that version update, but it's also up to the developer or the person who's maintaining this to also test that as well. So that's a two-edged sword with the pre-built connectors. The other thing is like, is there a dedicated person who or not who can take ownership of Celigo? Just because I would say like we saw although the user interface is makes it quite simple, but then there's also certain understandings of different vendors that becomes important, or just like reading through the documentation. So although they marketed this product for like non-technical users, I would say, I think at some point, depending on the complexity of the integration, there definitely needs to be someone who supports the product. And in addition to that, I think it's also important to have like a process to make changes, to review changes, and to push changes. I think one of the downsides with like tools where UI, where you can create these integrations, or even like, for example, a Shopify flow, is sometimes when things are too easy to do, things could be built in the in a way that might not be most optimal. And sometimes trying to fix or resolve that can be quite difficult. So I would probably treat this the same way as like committing code if possible. And also to help with like rollbacks or issues, set up those periodic backups. And in addition to that, like if scale is important, there are maybe other vendors that are larger, more enterprise level. I wouldn't say Celigo isn't enterprise level, but we'll take a look again in the next slide, like at different alternatives, and also the data compliance for making sure that Celigo fits within the client's policy. So yeah, I think these are the things to think about to see if Celigo is right for you. But like I said, if it ticks all the boxes, maybe that's a vendor that you can evaluate. And in terms of alternatives, I was just taking this from like the Gartner Magic Quadrant. We can see some of the bigger name players that are the leaders in the market, whether it be SAP, Informatica, Boomi, and Workato. So these are maybe more of the bigger, even more expensive vendors. I'll take, for example, Boomi, who's probably one of the strongest players according to Gartner. I mean, they have over 300,000 endpoint connections, so there's probably a big team to help support this. There's also a little bit more tools that they offer, API management, data management, and AI agents that can be put in to help throughout I don't know if they call it flows, but yeah, the Boomi might have a different term for it, but I think you understand what I'm saying there. Yeah, so looking at like on the flip side, there might be some other competitors more closely aligned with Celigo in terms of peer, which would be SnapLogic. So 1,000 pre-built connectors. I think it's quite close to Celigo. I just looked at Celigo. They have like 741 application connections. And maybe even on like the Challenger series side of things, like the AWS, they don't have a dedicated like integration platform as a service solution, but there are different AWS services that you could potentially string together to achieve the same thing. Of course, that's a more complexity, but then you have full control of that. So I think that's why they probably categorize them as the Challenger series, because a lot of their service offerings is not as strong as maybe some of the other ones. And I think the niche players we've probably all heard of: Zapier, workflow automation, application integration, quite a substantial number of connections. Though I think my understanding maybe it's just the scalability here that and the completeness of vision is why they might not be as strong as some of the players here. But I think those are the alternatives. To be honest, I've only worked with Celigo. In a previous time we were reviewing Informatica, but that's a long time ago. So I can't speak directly about how some of these other vendors perform compared to Celigo on a current basis. But I would say my experience with Celigo so far is, knowing those core foundations is quite helpful in diving in. But certain integrations can also be quite easy if it's like one of those pre-built ones. Some of them that could also be very complex as well. So I think at the end of the day, like I said, it's not a sell for or against Celigo, but hopefully you understand maybe some of the way Celigo works, and how potentially it could help with your client. But yeah, that's pretty much all I prepared for today. So I'm just going to open it up for any questions.
Is this useful in general for you, Andrew? I mean, many of the customer is using Celigo and NetSuite, but sometimes I start asking, why is this needed? And I think it's missing for me the whole reason behind these choices sometimes.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think one of the things is like Celigo, like if it's running well in the background, maybe we don't, maybe things are working. We don't see the impacts. But I think one of the things is like if Celigo starts breaking down, then a lot of the process breaks down. So for example, maybe one of the Shopify NetSuite flow integrations, one of their pre-built flows would be like if you're using NetSuite to manage all of the product data and you want to push that to Shopify, there's a flow that does that. So yeah, perhaps there are other ways to get that data from NetSuite into Shopify, but this is more of like a set and forget thing. But once things stop working, then maybe the Shopify product data gets out of sync from NetSuite. So that could cause a bunch of issues. I would say also like for a customer that's maybe using multiple applications, Celigo can be helpful, though. Because I would say like building an integration for all of these vendors can be quite costly, and it will take a lot to maintain as well. So to answer your question, is it useful? I think it's one of those things where if there's a budget for it, it just makes it easy so that the team can focus on other priorities. But if budget is an issue, then there are probably different alternatives that can be taken. I think even within Celigo, there are ways to optimize things like making sure we only have active connections, because if we have a connection enabled, we're not using the flow, we're being charged for it. So Celigo doesn't charge for like the amount of, let's say, triggered flows, but they charge by the number of connections. So auditing that, maintaining that on an ongoing basis could potentially be helpful. I don't know if that sort of answers your question.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, on the same topic, I found sometimes that Celigo and systems like that are really good to speed up the development at the beginning, but when the system starts to grow, it's become a nightmare to maintain, especially because it's hard to test the integration. I think that the only tests that you can do maybe are manual tests, because it's hard to test, to create actual automatic tests end-to-end, any test between the two systems. Maybe we can do it in some way, but I didn't see that practice applied in the actual projects that I worked on. And yeah, I want to know if you have the same feeling that when it starts to grow, it starts to lose the reason why you have it, to simplify stuff, basically. I think it was the main,
Yeah, I understand your pain point, and I think I feel it as well. Like the more connections that are being made, the more complex the flows become. It does become quite unwieldy, which is why I think going back, like you're right, Celigo makes it easy to build things, and like sometimes that ease makes it like so that we don't think through all the implications that could potentially happen. So I agree, like in that sense. In terms of testing, I know they have a sandbox environment, but I know certain things are quite difficult to test in a sandbox environment as well. And even within those flows, the case that I've seen was like just cloning that flow, testing it in isolation before applying the changes back. So yeah, I think there is some limitations to testing, at least in the way that we're used to. But yeah, I think if anything, one of those things that maybe I mentioned that now I want to take back, like creating it, setting it, and forgetting it is probably not the best thing. It's like continuously reviewing it, and maybe just making sure that there's like a not a it doesn't get too way out of hand, because certain things I think Celigo does well, but sometimes I've also seen instances where Celigo is just used to solve a specific problem that might not have to be Celigo. Though I know they try to push for making it like the centralized place to do it, but I think that could also be a double-edged sword, because now the merchant is so committed with Celigo that getting off Celigo is also impossible. But so I think one of those things where I mentioned earlier, like planning out the integration, having documentation, taking it like review, like as if we're committing code, reviewing it, it would be helpful. So yeah, I don't know if I think that's I guess my from my experience. Was it like with the pain points that you were having, well, what would you be able to share, like what you ended up moving forward with? Or
What we have right now, it's my main concern is that in our project we use a lot of code, JavaScript code inside the integrations, and all that code isn't tested at all with automatic tests.
yeah,
So the only way to test is using the sandbox and verify that the data go through. And when you add Celigo, I think in the team, you add another layer of communication that can have issues. That sometimes, in some cases, maybe in some flows, can be avoided because you can send information directly to the system, to the other system. We have, I feel that it's not only about Celigo, but mainly about this kind of system. I had the same feeling also with Segment, for example, where you integrate a lot of external services, but at the end, they sell to you that you just send the information and then there is a transformation that they do to send the right data to the final service. But at the end, you have to go in the configurations and change where you want that data to go. So it's a manual work that you have. It's hard to test, and I think I fail because maybe I'm more confident with the code, the unit test. In that case, sometimes will be faster to do just with an integration that calls the API locally. And usually we have also a queue system on our projects where we can retry stuff into the fields. But at the end, we do the same to send the data to these external services. We add the job in a queue that sends the data to these external services. But at that point, you can do a call to the final service directly. And yeah, that's my feeling always when I work on this stuff.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
maybe
No, I think I get your the pinpoints that you're seeing, and yeah, I think one of those things is like sometimes we inherit those problems. I don't know, it might be different if like we were able to, if there was a problem and then we get to decide how things are done. But I think in a lot of the cases, these tools have already been determined and already implemented. For me, at least, my suggestion to the client was like, because for us, like cost was a big thing. Like I think a lot of the integrations we have, I don't think we're using that many hooks. A lot of them are like the pre-built ones, which is kind of nice. But for them, like cost is a factor. So it was like just helping them identify which ones we are using, which ones we aren't using, because I think a lot of times things were like created and then kind of like it's not used anymore. They just turn it off, but there's no like cleanup afterwards. And I think that's something that's really important for tools like this, because then it just just grows. But I think for your case, I'm wondering, yeah, because it's quite hard. Like even if we were to test the JavaScript in isolation, if the input or the export or whatever part of the flow changes, then it makes sense to test as a whole thing. Yeah, I think that's quite a challenge. I guess if anything, it's probably the errors that are occurring within Celigo that is like, I guess we're testing in production because of that. But yeah, because I know in the sandbox there could be some limitations there. But yeah, if you do come up with a workaround, I would be definitely curious to know what you guys end up doing with it. Any other questions? Well, great. Well, thank you. I'll pass the floor back to you then, Alessio.
Okay, thank you. So no other questions. That was a great presentation. Thank you, Andrew. And see you next Wednesday. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Andrew. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.